So I'm going to talk about soil organic matter, a fulcrum with many forms and functions. Lots of F's there. What is a fulcrum? It's not the lever, but it is what the lever pries upon, right? It's the little thing that amplifies the effect of the lever. And so what we are trying to do in our management is to do really as little as possible to get the biggest effect, right? We need to think about how we can amplify our activities. And so soil organic matter, of course, is a small part of the soil, normally just a few percent, but it can have very large effects on soil function. So as was mentioned, I teach at Western Illinois University, about 3 hours north and west of here, and we would love to have any of you come and study agriculture, young or old. I currently have a farmer that has been farming for 40 years in one of my classes. That's the first time that I've had someone with that kind of experience, but obviously it adds tremendously to the discussions with the 18 through 22-year-olds. So when I talk to my students that are almost all from conventional grain production systems, they all have heard these kinds of stories from their family members about how much progress has been made in agriculture. And when they hear pushback about certain aspects of modern agriculture, they sometimes are frustrated because they say, we have tremendously improved our yields. Maybe we've tripled our yields in the lifetimes of some of the oldest family members. Now, I don't know if too many of the youngsters that hear that story about tripling of yields push back like this, but this, of course, is a question we should ask. If we have 3 times as much coming in, and obviously grain yield and residue input are not equivalent, but they are related, certainly we should have an increase in organic matter, right? We have 3 times as much coming in. We should be approaching 3 times the organic matter level. This is how I talk about this with my students, and we're actually discussing soil organic matter this week in my Intro Soils class. It's an amazing synchronicity. So I should be warmed up for talking about soil organic matter. About 1/3 of a grain plant, a mature grain plant, is the grain. And about 1/3 is the above ground residues, and about 1/3 is the roots. So of course we harvest the grain, which leaves behind about 2/3 of the total production. If we think about a 200 bushel corn crop, that's about 5 tons of grain. We're talking about maybe 10 tons of dry biomass being returned. And that 10 tons is equivalent to about 1% of an acre plow layer. So potentially, if all of the organic matter returned from that 200 bushel corn crop actually was retained in the soil, we would build our organic matter 1%. But what really happens to that residue? That, of course, is a very important riddle to consider. And this is from the Nature and Properties of Soil, a textbook that some of you might want to look into if you're looking for the big story of soil. This shows very clearly that the majority of the residue carbon goes back into the atmosphere within a year. 75% or more is typically released back into the atmosphere as CO2. What about the rest? Well, it's potentially becoming plant compounds that haven't broken down yet, so residue of plants, the more resistant materials. It's potentially becoming living biomass. The things that we're feeding on that residue have incorporated some of that carbon into their bodies. And then, of course, we have microbial compounds. The production that we think of as being solely a plant aspect of the production system is also happening in the soil, in the microbes' bodies. They are producing just like the plants are producing. And what we are learning is that soil organic matter is mostly microbial produced, or derived from microbial biomass, rather than actually being just an accumulation of plant residues. So let's think about the kind of the big story. What have we accomplished during the modern era of agriculture that we've increased our yields so much? This was a study done in Iowa, 82 pedons. A pedon is what we use when we're mapping soils. So it's a soil body that we describe in detail. And so when 82 soils were described in detail back maybe 50 plus years ago, they were described as having certain properties that we could use to identify how they taxonomically fit into soil survey. Well, so what this study involved was they came back and they looked at those same pedons again. And what they found was that, and they looked actually using 3 different taxonomic systems, the US taxonomy, but also Canadian and the FAO world system. They found that 11 to 33% of the pedons that had been mapped as black prairie soils actually no longer even qualified as black prairie soils. Of course, the 11 to 33% is because there were 3 different systems they were looking at, but a substantial number, as much as a third of the soils that were mapped as black prairie soils, no longer qualified as black soils. That's obviously not progress. This is another interesting study. This was done over in the Netherlands, and they looked at the same soil series, so the same taxonomic unit with long-term management differences. And the way Bouma described this is very interesting. I think some of you have heard of the concept of a genotype. It's basically what the genes create as the possibility, but then you have the phenotype is how those genes are expressed. We can think about the inherent properties of soil, the texture, the mineralogy, things that are the given factors that define a soil type. And then we can think about how they are modified by management. And so that's how a genoform turns into the phenoform. And there we have these 3 phenoforms. The conventional management had substantially less organic matter than under organic management, and the most organic matter was under long-term perennial sod. But they also looked in great detail at different functions of these soils, and they found that there were very large differences as well. So we have the inherent properties being the same for the 3 soils, and they looked at many different locations for each of these 3 categories and found some consistency, more organic matter and more functionality where they had the phenotype being influenced by organic production, arable production, and also perennial sod. So I think it's pretty clear that the amount of organic matter in a soil is not just defined by the inherent properties of the soil. It's also influenced by the inputs and outputs of organic matter related to management. So we can think about this balance. Inputs, plant materials grown in place, microbial materials grown in place. But we also can have redistribution on farm where we might produce crops that we feed to livestock, and then we move the manure around where we want to put it on our farm. We also can, of course, import organic materials, and some farms do this very intensively, bringing in organic residues from other locations. Of course, we also have organic losses. When we harvest, we are removing organic materials from the system that otherwise would be returned. When we have decomposition, obviously that's a major loss pathway. We said that about 75% or more of all of the residues coming in are back in the atmosphere within a year. And then, of course, we also have other losses, such as erosion. When you look at why soils in a landscape have higher or lower organic matter levels, erosion is actually a major part of the story. The upland, the hilltops, the back slopes have lower organic matter, and the catchment areas have higher organic matter, not just because of differences in decomposition, but largely in many of our agricultural landscapes because of differences in erosion history. So how do we kind of put all these together, all these ideas together, and think about the effect of agriculture? This is just an opinion piece, a classic opinion piece from now over 20 years ago. But if you haven't read this classic commentary, I recommend that you take a look. It does a very good job of helping us think about what we are doing in our modern production systems, producing very high yields of very simple and very uniform residues. Conventional row crop agriculture, putting America's soils on a white bread diet. And basically what the author argues is that some of the loss of function and the need for inputs and other types of remediations is because of the way we are feeding our soil. You know, I don't think we could really argue that in modern agriculture we are not returning organic matter. We're returning large amounts of residues, but those are not the types of residues that perhaps will optimize the digestive system of the soil. This is actually from a presentation. Jen mentioned the eye of the needle being the microbial biomass through which all nutrients have to pass. The guy who came up with that concept was over in England, and this was a presentation that he was sharing about that concept of the eye of the needle. And you could see all the microbes in the bottom, the micro herd, perhaps. The basic concept that I want to emphasize here is that the microbial community responds when we have high inputs. Whether they be high inputs of residue or high inputs of fertilizer, the metabolism of that soil digestive system and that soil body changes. And so our modern production systems really aren't lacking in carbon inputs, but they are different in how they process that carbon and how that carbon drives function. So this is a very simple way to think about the whole great mixture of soil organic matter. We have the vast majority of it is relatively stable, decomposes slowly, maybe 1% to 2% of that organic matter decomposes in a year. But we have a small fraction, the active fraction, that is partly the living organisms and then is partly the recent residues. And in terms of driving ecological function, it's the top of the triangle. It's the active fraction that has much more influence. The stabilized organic matter is very important for holding on to water, holding on to nutrients, and some other functions. But the active fraction is what drives the ecological function. Historically, that stabilized organic matter we referred to as humus. And that's a concept that I think almost everybody in this room probably is very familiar with, the concept of humus, that we're trying to build humus in our soils. What you may not be aware of is that the concept of humus is actually a hotly debated topic. It's a very contentious topic. In fact, this article that appeared in Nature, very prestigious scientific journal of Nature, 2 years ago said, early research based on an extraction method assumed that a humification process creates recalcitrant, which is resistant to decomposition, and also these large humic substances that make up the majority of soil humus. However, these humic substances have not been observed by modern analytic techniques. The basic idea here is that when we do the extractions that get out fulvic acids and humic acids, basically when we use strong alkaline extractants, we get out things that we can quantify, but those are artifacts that really aren't the stuff that, when we look using the most modern techniques at what's actually in the soil, and then we compare it with what we extract out, we realize that the extracts contain things that are changed by the extraction process. And humic and fulvic acids are not probably the real materials that are functioning in real soils. That's what this article argues. Now, this is contentious. Not everybody agrees with this, because for 100 years plus, people have been doing these extractions and trying to understand the value of humic and fulvic acids. In fact, in the next agronomy meeting, soil science and agronomy meetings, there's going to be a session where we will actually discuss whether humic research has any meaning or value. That's rather interesting, that something that has been the foundation of many people's perspective on humus is now going to be debated as to whether it has any value at all. And it should be interesting. There will be a morning debate between the proponents and opponents, and then there will be a poster session. And if any of you are in that scientific community, I hope that you will consider attending. And if you are not, maybe you can take a look at some of the papers that are produced. Okay. The fact is there has been a tremendous amount of research on soil organic matter, and the great majority of it has actually been recent. If you take a look here, I know in the back you can't read this, but that's 35,000 articles in 2016. What in the world is going on? What's driving this? Why are we so much more interested in soil organic matter today? Well, I think climate change and concerns about carbon in and out of the atmosphere and the role of soil as a place to sequester carbon is what's driving this. It's not interest in organic farming specifically. But of course there is also more interest in how to manage our agricultural systems more sustainably. But I think the biggest driver of this is interest in carbon in the atmosphere and how that could be put back in the soil. There are some other things that are also contentious. I want to kind of just do a quick review of some of the literature. This was a great opportunity for me putting this set of slides together. I'm normally so focused on teaching the fundamentals to my students that I don't get to do all this literature review. But over the last 24 hours, I did lots of literature review, and so here are some of the highlights. Soil organic matter is supposed to increase plant available water, right? I mean, that's just a standard concept that we all accept. Well, this was a study that just came out 2017, 50,000 different soil water measurements from a large, set of databases from 60 different published studies were compiled, and the meta-analysis, looking at everything together, showed that a 1% increase in organic carbon had a very small effect, about 1% increase in the amount of plant available water. And that was on average across all the soils. There were some soils, sandy soils, benefit more than soils that have a high clay content. Higher clay content soils actually, in many cases, there was no benefit at all, actually. Okay, this is lots of data that's compiled, but what this is showing is on the y-axis is change in water content per change in organic matter. And the higher the plot, the bigger the change. I know we can't all see this in the back, but the take-home message here is that the main thing that was changed was not plant available water. The main thing that was changed was the macroporosity of the soil. And the biggest changes were in the sandy soils. Those are shown over on the left, whereas the changes in the finer soils with more clay were smaller. This is another presentation of the same data, and the basic idea is that we can get up to 1% or more change in plant available water, but that's primarily occurring in the sandy soils. In the finer textured soils, there's much less effect, if any effect at all. Another way to look at this is something I have my students use. This is a hydraulic properties calculator. We can put in the texture, put in the organic matter content, put in the density, bulk density, and we can look at how hydraulic properties change when we change those types of variables. What this shows is that the available water, when we went from 2% organic matter up to 5% organic matter, the available water increased just 10%. That's really very small, okay? That's like adding, I won't crunch the numbers, but that might be adding another day of water availability to your crop. We're not talking about adding weeks. We're talking about adding a small amount of available water. What really changed was the hydraulic conductivity. That went up 150%. Hydraulic conductivity is how rapidly water moves through soil. Where does the water move through the soil? Where are the pipes? It's the macropores. So when we build organic matter content, we are not increasing the little pores that hold the plant available water nearly as much as we are building the macropores that move not just water, but also air and roots and organisms through the soil. Okay, so I'm not trying to tell you that organic matter doesn't improve plant available water. I think the mechanism, though, is not so much building the sponge as it is increasing infiltration and movement through the sponge, and also increasing the depth, the volume of soil that roots can acquire water from. Okay? Okay, another very important concept, I mentioned earlier that microbial products, rather than plant products, are really now, we're thinking that those are the materials that build organic matter. It's not just accumulating the resistant plant materials, it's actually building microbes and all of their residues that builds organic matter. Almost everybody thinks of microbes primarily involved with decomposition. That, in metabolic terms, that would be catabolism. But we can also think about anabolic function, right? When you're building muscle, anabolic function, building microbes, building microbial biomass is what this article is about, the importance of anabolism in microbial control over soil organic carbon storage. And basically what they are laying out here in this article, very recent article, is the concept that what we are trying to do is build as much microbial biomass as possible, so get the plants transformed not into just old plant materials, but into new microbial biomass. And then we also need this entombing effect, because the microbial biomass, much more so than the plant materials, can get stabilized in the soil through its interactions with the soil chemical and physical properties. Okay, so the basic idea here is that we can have plant materials that are getting processed, and we end up with kind of the bones left behind as the carcass has been consumed. But we also have plant materials that have been assimilated and transformed as new materials are getting produced. And so that whole, that combination of plant materials getting taken apart and new microbial biomass getting built, that's the microbial carbon pump. And then the entombing effect, stabilizing those microbial residues, is what has to happen next if we want to build stable organic matter. Okay, so I already explained this, but it's basically the idea, as I just said, of the plant materials get taken apart, and very little of what turns into stable organic matter is that old plant material. We used to think that. That was a very important part of the humus concept, that compounds like lignin, the tough stuff in our plants, the stuff that holds up the trees, we thought that that stuff accumulated and maybe condensed and stabilized. What we're thinking now is that really everything can be taken apart. And what makes stable organic matter is when it gets put back together again into the microbial biomass that then gets stabilized through this entombing effect. Okay, so when the entombing effect is greater than the priming effect, that's when we actually build organic matter. What is the priming effect? The priming effect is when we add fresh organic materials to the soil, that makes the microbes more active. This is happening in the root zone, right? In the rhizosphere, the microbes get activated by the exudates. They decompose more of the organic materials and they provide more nutrition to the plants. But that is taking apart materials to make them plant available. To build organic matter, we need to have the anabolic effect, not just the catabolic effect. And so we need to have the priming effect occur in the right places where the microbes turn unavailable nutrients into available nutrients, but we also need to have the entombing effect where the organic materials, not plant residues, but the microbial residues, are getting captured and stabilized on mineral surfaces and in soil structure. Okay? This is just one example of one of the many articles that's come out in the last couple of years looking at how this specifically happens. The soil fungi, they are producing plant molecules that have been changed, so they're modifying the plant molecules so they are more likely to get stuck on mineral surfaces, but they're also producing metabolites that are much more reactive with mineral surfaces that get stuck on those mineral surfaces. So I'm not saying that the plant residues, the accumulation of old plant materials is not part of the organic matter. What we're finding, though, is that that's much less important than the microbial materials. Okay. Now, let's come back to the story of modern agriculture. These high residue inputs, why are they not building organic matter? I've already said that these high residue inputs are changing the metabolism, and obviously the same diet will have a different effect on someone with a high metabolism versus a slower metabolism. This is an interesting article that looked at the effect of different quantities of residue. And what they found was the higher the residue input, specifically above ground residue input, the less the carbon got stabilized. The higher the input, the less the carbon input led to actual entombed carbon, or carbon that was captured in a stable form in the soil. Roots did not respond the same way. So more roots actually led to more stable carbon. But more shoots, it basically just led to more priming effect. So you had more residue coming in, the fire burned hotter, but less was getting stabilized on mineral surfaces or in structural units. Okay, and so I think we'll just keep moving on here. So how do we put this how do we put this together in a system that makes sense? I mean, I'm not telling you that we should have less residue inputs, okay, even though that may be part of the explanation why really high yield corn doesn't build very much organic matter. What I'm trying to tell you is when we look at the studies, what we find is that it's not just the quantity of residue, it's also the different forms of residue and when the residue is coming in. This is an interesting meta-analysis, crop rotations for increased soil carbon, perenniality as a guiding principle. What they found was that when you have perennials in the system, like long-term sod, CRP, or alfalfa, you build organic matter. I think we know that. But if you make your annual cropping system have more of a perennial character by combining summer annuals with winter annuals, you add perenniality to the system as well. And so they also found that it wasn't just diversity of plants that mattered, it was functional diversity, having plants that are functioning in different ways, in different growing seasons. Though, when you add functional diversity more so than species diversity, you end up with building more organic matter. Okay. Okay, let's just talk very quickly about humic products. I'm trying to give you just some insights into where the current literature is taking us. Humic products are these things like humates that are being marketed. Lots of different companies are selling humates. So what is the current science? What's the latest science telling us about these? Well, this article just came out and it says, we believe the industry will indeed become more knowledge-based and the credibility of humic products will improve as we learn more about their field efficacy across ranges of field conditions for improving crop yield and soil health. They're saying that there are finally some long-term studies looking at humate products, okay? And the authors of this article have been involved with doing some of that work in Iowa. We gained further insights into possible mechanistic explanations. How do the humates actually function? And the consumer will gain the ability to discern genuine products from fraudulent materials. There are so many different humate products out there. We need to know which products are better than other products. And just let me give you a very quick way to think about this. These materials, humic and fulvic acids, they are the product of extraction. They are an artifact of how you extract the materials. And you don't have to extract them from the soil. You can extract them from a variety of other materials as well. And most of the humates that are on the market are being extracted from mined materials, veins of ancient carbon similar to coal. Not the same as coal, but similar to coal. This is how I explain this concept to my students. Fulvic acid is the artifact of an extraction process, and we could just as easily talk about Tidic acid being the extraction when we wash our dirty clothes with Tide. Fulvic acids are not specific compounds. They are the result of a process of extracting them. That doesn't mean that they have no value. It just means that we need to try to speak about them more accurately, okay? And the industry has come up with a standardized method for quantifying humic and fulvic acids in these materials. If a company is offering you a product, ask them, have you had your products analyzed using the new standardized method? And if they haven't done that, just like when you are buying a fertilizer, you want to see the analysis. When you buy a humate, you want to see the analysis. And the reputable companies now are using this extraction, this standardized extraction procedure. Okay, so humate products are not a substitute for good soil organic management. They are not the same as soil organic matter, but they do have function. There is more and more evidence that they can promote seedling vigor. They can have, some people would describe it as a hormonal effect. They are having effects that are like a fulcrum, much larger than you would expect. And we actually are just beginning to understand why those effects are occurring. The mechanisms are still pretty obscure, but the effect is not the same as growing a cover crop and having it decompose in place. It's a different type of effect. Okay, so let's just wrap up here and think about how we can do some assessment of soil organic matter. This was a great article that came out recently about the permanganate oxidizable carbon method. I saw Ray Weil in the back. He was a leader in bringing this test to NRCS. Now it's being widely used. And they were comparing this method, the permanganate method, with some other methods. And what they found was the permanganate method was a good predictor of when you were building organic matter. And some other methods, like measuring the respiration, the microbial respiration, were good indicators of not building organic matter, but releasing nutrients from organic matter. You need both things. We need organic materials being turned into plant-available nutrients so that our crops are well fed, and we also need to be building organic matter. Those are two different functions that we need to think about, okay? So we can measure respiration in soil. This is the Solvita test. Anybody had the Solvita test done? I have my students do this. We compared soil in their crop fields in the fence row, and consistently, the fence row has more respiration during a 24-hour incubation after wetting dry soil. Okay? But the Solvita test is expensive. I mean, it's not that expensive. It's only about $10 a pop, but when you look at what it's actually doing, it seems like there should be a cheaper way. Okay? And so this is a method that I'm working on right now. This actually, we take a little cuvette, we put in a gel that we impregnate with a pH indicator, and as respiration occurs, the gel changes, or the pH indicator changes color. And so it's a way that for about 50 cents a shot, we can measure the respiration as accurately, if not more accurately, than the Solvita method. Okay, so let me just emphasize this message here. This is something that the NRCS has been saying now for maybe a decade. They used to emphasize the concept of T. T is tolerable soil loss. Another way to say it is T is tolerable soil degradation. And that should not be our goal, right? We shouldn't be managing for tolerable degradation. We should be managing for improved function. And the simplest thing that we can look at to tell us whether we're improving function is improved carbon levels in our soil. But of course, there are many different types of carbon. We need the carbon that's accumulating, and then we also need the carbon that's dynamic, releasing the associated nutrients. Okay? It really is possible to build organic matter. Some farmers are doing it. And I guess what I would leave you with is the soils that are most degraded, that are most below what is possible for that soil. Perhaps the fence row in your field can tell you what is possible. There are different ways to identify what's possible, but the soils that are the farthest below what's possible are the soils that will respond the most to building soil organic matter, to improved organic matter management practices. And I think I'm out of time.